Before we start, if you're enjoying these conversations, please make sure that you like, subscribe, and leave a review for Cleaning Up. It really helps other people to find us. Also, find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram, where you can watch highlights from each episode, read my takeaways, and keep up with all things Cleaning Up. Cleaning Up is brought to you by our lead supporter, Capricorn Investment Group, the Liebreich Foundation, and the Gilardini Foundation. Hello, I'm Michael Liebreich, and this is Cleaning Up. We're joined today by a returning guest, Damilola Ogunbiyi. Damilola is the CEO of Sustainable Energy for All, that's the UN initiative, and she's also co-chair, along with our guest from episode 118, Achim Steiner, of UN Energy. Damilola was last with us in November 2021. That was just before COP26, episode 62 of Cleaning Up. So let's hear about developments since then in the world of energy access. Please join me in welcoming Damilola Ogunbiyi to Cleaning Up. Damilola, welcome back to Cleaning Up.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me back.
Now, you were our guest on episode 62, which is actually as long ago as 2021. It was just before the Glasgow COP26 meeting. So I hope you've been well since then.
Absolutely. And great to see all the success with the show and the amazing guests that you've had on since I've been here.
Now, we met briefly a few weeks ago at the Energy Institute dinner where you were being honored. You got the President's Award. So let me start by congratulating you again on that.
Thank you, Michael. It was a great honor.
Now, what I'd like to do to start with is just to review those 2 years since you were last on the show, because they've been incredibly turbulent years in the energy space. We had, at the end of COVID, the prices starting to ramp up. And then, of course, this terrible trauma of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what that did to energy prices, this extraordinary spike where we're hopefully now, well, we have been coming down the far side, and hopefully that continues. What has that done to your missions of energy access, renewables, energy efficiency? Has it set it back? Have people been, worried about other things, or have you made progress?
Well, it's kind of a double-edged sword, to be honest. I mean, the crisis has caused kind of multiple crises in terms of energy, food, and finance, right? So on the good side, it has allowed people to really look at, the debt servicing and what's really happening with countries. What does food security really mean? And what does energy security mean? And it has meant a boost in renewables. Like, the EU will double the amount of renewables that they have by between 2022 and 2027, which shows that we can do things at scale. On the other side, what it also has meant is that there's a rapid growth of getting to clean energy in the global north that we're not seeing the same thing in the global south, especially in the developing world. So what has really happened is that, things have been a bit stagnant in the developing world and not as much growth in terms of, the amount of renewables or clean energy or even power development actually happening. We still have, I believe these new tracking reports for this year will show that you still probably have about 600 million without access to electricity, which is better, than having 759 million, but it isn't fast enough, right? And now we're looking at 2021 figures. So we're in COVID time, but we're not looking at the figures yet for the people who went back to extreme poverty. And the people that go back to extreme poverty are normally the people that, lose their access to energy, go back to not having access to clean cooking. So it has made it even more important for us to stress that, look, the energy transition cannot happen without energy access. And unlike other countries that are switching from one fuel source to another fuel source, in the context of people who don't have energy at all, they just want some energy. So we've been stressing that point. We've been helping a lot of governments now with what does the energy transition plan look like. So my government in Nigeria announced, net zero by 2060, which is a big deal for a big oil and gas nation. We're now doing the same energy transition and green growth plans for Kenya, Ghana, Barbados. So you have a lot of governments now saying, okay, we don't want to be left behind. how do we make sure we're in this conversation, and what is the cost and the conversation? What we're not seeing is the money on the table to help countries really develop. There's still a huge gap. I believe in 2021 or between 2020 and 2022, it was only 1.5% of all the money that went into renewables actually went into sub-Saharan Africa. So you've got 15% of the world's population only having that level of investment. So the inequality is a real issue, and that's what we're trying to stress and drive and make sure it's a key agenda for COP28 in the UAE.
Thank you very much. And that's a great summary. I'm going to just pull out one number that you used there, which was 600 million without access to electricity. And taking your caveat that might have gone backwards, I would just say that, when I started working on, was prior to Sustainable Energy for All, and it was called the UN Coordinating Initiative on Energy, which would have been about 2008. The number was 1.4 billion. And so, you kind of have to take the win, but it's completely, it's still inadequate. There's still 600 million. And of course, how are we doing with cooking? Do you have a metric on clean cooking?
So on cooking, I believe we're about 2.4 billion now. That might go down to 2.2 billion. So it's still an issue. And on the access side,
that has hardly moved. I mean, over that period where electricity access, non-access has more than halved, the clean cooking, I think it's the same number that we were using back then.
And what is so sad is just the level of investment in cooking. You're still talking about the millions instead of the billions that go into cooking. So it's no surprise that it hasn't moved because of the lack of investment. But what is surprising is that clean cooking is actually one of the major effects to climate, right? Chopping trees down and it's almost like you don't make that connection. And then what is really worrying and very, very close to my heart is just the level of mortality. There's probably about 1 million people a year that die from this indoor air pollution. So it can be solved. And it shocks me that, as a global construct, we don't think 1 million people dying every year is an emergency, right? So there are those type of very, very key issues that we just have to be part of, and we have to keep on reinforcing that it's not okay to continue this way. And you have to also understand, when I talk about the financing, doing a project in Europe or in the global north is completely different in emerging economy and developing countries. Like some developing countries' projects are circa 20% interest rates, right? So even if you want to do it, it's just not viable. So there's issues with local currency, there are issues with Forex. But again, if things are crisis, like how we saw with COVID response, then the money is made available, and it should be made available quickly. So we're also challenging the DFIs on your processes, your procedures, and how much money is available, and how you should make sure or try and make sure you limit these things. As you know, Michael, I ran the largest energy access program on the continent before, which was a program with the World Bank and the AFDB, and I know what it's like to go through that process. One of my jobs now is to make sure no other country has to go through that, because we can't keep on having the one program in Africa over 500 million. We should have had 20 to 25 of these projects by this time.
Let's come back to the question of finance. I know you and your team have been doing a lot of work on that, but I want to just stick with cooking, because I don't think it gets enough attention. I couldn't agree with you more. 1 million people dying of indoor air pollution is, it never gets the attention that it deserves. I'm always amazed how many column inches or how many internet screens are devoted to climate crisis and, the deaths from, for instance, storms or floods. But they are so small, all tragic, but so small compared to, actually, there's another one, which is road deaths, which is also over 1 million a year globally. But cooking, is fairly and squarely our problem. It doesn't get the attention. Do we yet know what are the actual technological solutions? Because, clearly just saying, they should all get electric hobs is not realistic, given the poverty of a lot of the people, who are cooking currently with firewood or charcoal or even dung. So what is the solution? What are the programs that you ran in Nigeria, or the programs that you would like to see funded What actually are they?
I think I want to step back a little bit because we were talking about electrification and I forgot to mention a big point. The reason why the electrification figures jumped so much was really because of one country, which is India. India had to power 1.2 billion people. So India provided power to about 700 million people in the last 10 years, right? And it's really important to put it in perspective. So it's not like, okay, it happened everywhere, right? But, it specifically happened in India. I'm now saying that in terms of cooking. So let's move on to clean cooking now. There's a lot more in terms of technology, in terms of clean cooking stoves. There's a lot more in terms of pellets that you can use. And now there's even some handy kind of almost solar home system device type of cooking solutions because people know that you don't need as much as needed. I think why it's just so critical to attack cooking is because people don't talk about the gender-based violence. I mean, we were parts of Sudan the other time. They're like, oh yeah, so I'm going to go out, probably be raped on my way back. It's just how it is on my way to collect fuel wood. And I was like, what? You have 1 in 4 times more likely to be beaten up by your own spouse when food is already on time. It's just an awful, awful existence. So I get very upset when people go, oh, let's not put in these new technologies and stop the way of life or the way they enjoy cooking. That is absolute nonsense. There's no woman who wants to walk 4 to 5 hours a day, risk of getting raped, to get fuel wood, to come back, to spend another 5 hours trying to cook. So it's not there. What is important is that these things have to be affordable and have to be sustainable. And for that, you have to have subsidies. So we're working on a subsidy program now, a results-based subsidy program now for cooking, for clean cooking. So if you install a clean cooking solution, in a household, we will provide you funding post-installation to make sure you did that project. These things are important because you have to understand that these people are used to the fuel source they use, which is wood, being free. So it's not that easy to say we're just going to charge this, we're not going to charge that. But if it is a climate crisis that we say it is something that we should be able to put together to afford. It will create so many jobs for women within those localities to get right. And we've done a lot of work on even mapping clean cooking now. So we have integrated energy plans that are beyond electrification. They also show cooking and they also show cooling. Where is it needed? Where the agricultural spots that could do with cold storage to avoid food not being spoiled. Which primary healthcare centers do you have to put power to so people don't die? It seems very basic, but a lot of people just have a plan for cooking, a plan for cooling, a plan for electrification. They haven't put it all together, in something the policymakers can use to define their mandates for the countries.
And one thing that when I was working on these issues more intensively came up was LPG, to say, well, look, the simplest swap to get, particularly for the health implications, is to go to LPG so that there's no firewood, no charcoal, no dung, nothing, and you've moved. And because electrification of cooking is hard. I mean, you say that there are solutions. You need quite a lot of electricity. It's not just a small panel on the roof before you can go to an electrical solution. Yeah. And so again, it's very difficult for me sitting in London, or here I am today in Switzerland, to say, oh, LPG is a fossil fuel and it's evil and bad and you shouldn't do that, and you should spend another 10, 15, 20 years cooking with fuels that are bad for your health. Has the technology sort of moved on to the point where that's no longer the picture, where we really can go to electrification?
We can go to electrification. We just need to understand the needs. And you have to understand that LPG, it all depends on if countries have that as well, right? So there's also a great expense if you have to truck it in and you have to bring it in. That's why it's so important to do projects and plans based on what is locally available in those communities, and in those places. I don't think anybody would say switching fuel wood to another power source is wrong, right? But what could be sustainable? And the last 4 or 5 years, like I was in Ghana earlier, I think it's this year. Sorry, I'm mixing my years for the Clean Cooking Conference. And I was astounded with the level that the technology had gone to. It's just like back in the day, how you couldn't imagine, you have those storage points for electrification, and now you have 5 kVA nicely packed or 10 kVA on the side. You never had that before. You'd have rolls and rolls of, gel batteries. So technology has moved forward. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Is the price point perfect? No, but the price point for clean cooking is never going to be perfect if we do not invest a lot of money into it, right? So I believe as of last year, the year before, there was already $37 million invested in the whole clean cooking sector, right? To drive these technologies, you need about $4 billion a year. So you see for us to even know what the perfect balance will be. So we're not there yet with the funding, and I'm shocked that we even have this amount of innovation just based on the little amounts of money that actually goes into that sector. And the CCA, I hope one day you get to interview Dimfna, Clean Cooking Alliance, have been doing an amazing job on just getting clean cooking on the map for you to talk about clean cooking alongside electrification. But there's still a lot of money needed for something that affects us climate-wise, probably more than anything.
It's really exciting that there is that level of innovation. It sounds like I need to check back into my clean cooking technologies and see what's there. But you make a very good point, which is that if the solution is currently regarded as free, in other words, firewood, maybe charcoal. Charcoal's not free in these countries, is it? But dung and firewood are, and therefore, ultimately, it's just going to have to be somebody puts their hand in their pocket, in the same way that is needed to upgrade sanitation, for instance, or to provide sort of basic education. It's a right and a need, and we're just going to have to do it. But you have also been innovating on the finance side. So let's come back to finance now. And you've been doing some really interesting things around carbon finance, around different models of finance. Can you share what you've been working on?
Okay, great. And thank you for asking. Well, actually 3 key programs that we're pushing on. The first one is we actually have a subsidy program called the Universal Energy Facility. And what that does is that it takes people who connect mini grids or solar for productive uses to the energy, either the consumer on the household level or the business level. You provide them a subsidy, so it's viable. So put in kind of very crude language. Let's say a connection costs $100, say, but to make it affordable, it really needs to be $70. We provide that $30 for it to be sustainable and for that business to run. Why it was important not just to do household and to do businesses is because we actually listen to the public. And a lot of people in these communities were saying that if you provide us power where I work, which is where I am for 16, 18 hours a day, I will sort out my home because I will have disposable income. It's also important that the SME market are the closest in terms of driving GDP. So we've been looking at that. Currently, that is pure philanthropically funded. People fund us, and we on lend. We're in 5 countries right now: Nigeria, Sierra Leone, DRC, Benin, and Madagascar.
What I wanted to ask is, how do you get those subsidies to the level of the SME or the home? Because there's a real challenge of scaling these programs, because it's nice to go and give somebody $30 that makes the difference, but that's how do you get it between, in a sense, your office and that person?
Oh no, you're not giving the person, you're giving the operator. So we're giving the developer. So, and that's why the local content comes in. So what happens is there's a lot of already local entrepreneurs, right, who've already gotten a catchment area with people that they wanted to supply energy to. For them to even get their loans, they need, if you think about it, we're kind of like their guarantee almost. They take our grant agreement saying that they will definitely pay us a subsidy if you give me money to connect. If you think about it, again, in the crudest manner, they then connect to the customers. They don't get paid until they're connected, by the way. So you're not giving any money upfront. You're giving money after you verify the connection, which is why it's different. There's been lots of projects, even with government, that, you do everything upfront, and that hasn't necessarily gotten any more electricity, if we're going to be very honest. And it is also in their favor to continue it and for us to continue tracking so they can be part of subsequent subsidy programs. I believe resource-based financing, not just the one we're doing, is how things should work. But I believe it's also a way that it can happen quickly. So you can go in from like application, to approval, that you've gotten it in about 3 months instead of what normally happens, which is like a 2-year process, right? Because one, these guys can't afford it. And why are you being so strenuous with them? Because if they don't connect the customer, you're not paying. So those are the types of things that we're trying to do. We are not the World Bank, but we're trying to set it up so we encourage the enabling environment. So in terms of, let's take Sierra Leone or Benin, it allows us to test the regulation. It allows us to even support the regulator with their applications for land, for permits, for things like that. And just because people, it's so easy for people to say, oh, that country is not ready, or the bottlenecks, but sometimes they just don't know. They don't know what they need to do. So it's important, especially from my experience in Nigeria, where, 10 years ago, people were saying solar doesn't work. That was it in Nigeria, if we're going to be really, really honest. Till now, that you have hundreds of megawatts, probably have 120,000 connections every single month. That took a process, and that took a lot of education. And those are the things that we want to thrive. We're not there just giving money. We have to educate everybody in the value chain, including the developers, on how to do this.
So I don't know if you know that I did a project in Sierra Leone, the only project that I've ever tried to do in any of these countries, which was a neonatal intensive care hospital, which had intermittent power. And every time there was a power cut, the babies would die because they need oxygen and warmth. And we did a project, and it was enormously successful. But the learnings, you have to do the stuff to learn. You have to do it. And then you learn about where the bottlenecks are. They're not where you expect them.
Exactly.
And that project actually, it fell over during COVID. I think we had a fire in the battery bank for some reason we don't know, but we're now restoring it. So I'm going to do an episode later with the doctor.
And maybe you can come with me. We're doing 6 primary healthcare centers now, solar plus storage, which is so exciting. Primary healthcare is very, very close to my heart because it directly links to infant mortality. And I feel like if you have
those 6, are they
a baby life, like what else do you want in life?
Are those 6 in Sierra Leone?
Yes, they're very little. So I'll leave the details to them. Yeah. Well, again, it's not necessarily our job to go and be fixing things like that, but we wanted to show that the solutions, the designs and things that we've been saying in our primary healthcare center work, we wanted to show it working. And luckily, thanks to FCDO, they gave us that opportunity to show, okay, what does sustainability really look like? What does your O&M really should look like? What do you need to factor in? What reserve batteries do you need in place? What reserve panels do you need in place? What can go wrong? What should be the affordability cost? And I started my life on primary health electrification, so I'm super excited that I get a chance to do this in Sierra Leone now.
Well, that's a fantastic invitation to come and visit that, because I do at some point need to go to visit the installation, and it's I think it's the second largest city in Bo, and we're going to get it back operating. It's at the moment, it's operating in the sense that there's a diesel generator powering the stuff we put in, but obviously we want to get it back onto the batteries and solar. Yeah. And that is a current project that I'm working on. And then I'll want to go and visit it. And I would love to, visit other installations.
When we go and commission ours, maybe I just invite you to come along.
Excellent. Let's do that. And I must introduce you to the extraordinary doctor who set up the neonatal intensive care unit. But you said there were 3, and that's 1. So that's a grant program going to developers who are making new electrical connections to businesses and homes. What's number 2?
Number 2 is the African Carbon Market Initiative, of which we worked on with the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, GIAP, and also the Rockefeller Foundation. And this was, the thinking around this was very simple. It was, how do you scale up high integrity African carbon credits to make sure that Africa is not left behind when everybody is claiming carbon credits, and it being almost like the biggest net exporter of this, to be able to fund the transition. So we have all sorts of programs from, we actually just had a event in Nairobi 2 days ago with developers. We're going to have a register of projects that are carbon credit worthy at different stages, so everyone around the world can see that. We have an advanced market commitment section, of which we already have 200 million of advanced market commitments. based on high integrity. We have another section that's looking at, it's okay for people to get the money, but how do we get the money to the local communities, really get the money to the local communities? What should be the split? How exactly does it work? That is a very important component. And I'm going to say finally, I do think it's finally, there's a workforce component. And then finally, we are also working on what does a carbon market activation plan actually look like for countries. So Kenya is first. We're then going to move to Ghana and Rwanda. And, we'll try and do as many as we can, but it's to do with funding. And that's looking at everything from your regulations to your policies to what is stopping it in your laws, everything that you need to do to really, really scale up. We are starting with the voluntary market, but eventually, obviously, you want to get to a compliance state. So we're doing that. And I'm also, obviously speaking to the EU and the Europeans who always want to do something with Africa and say, can you put some lifts on your carbon market? Can we really look at this pricing stuff? Because it's just not okay for the same ton of carbon in Rwanda to be sold for $3 and in Europe to be sold for like 100. It's just not just. So I'm super, super excited about that. I'm learning every day about the carbon market, but it's just, it's the innovation that we need. It's the, when everything else is going along, but we need new injections of disruption, innovation to really give people hope. And so that's what the African Carbon Market Initiative will do. The last one, which isn't necessarily...
Damilola, before you move on, if we take this in order, I want to comment on that because it's such a shame that you and I did not have this conversation in 2020. Because in 2020, I identified the exact same issue you've put your finger on, which is the risk is absolutely by far the largest potential new entrant into the carbon credit provision, into this as a source of carbon credits, of actually emission reduction opportunities, is Africa. And it would be completely unacceptable for a whole bunch of companies to go and buy those credits for, $5, for them to be low integrity credits, for them to say, oh, well, we've done this and we've done that. And at the time, all of these companies, all the oil companies, all the airlines, they were all saying, oh, we're going to do, we can't change our business model, but we'll buy credits. And you knew that the risk is they'll buy them for $5. Yeah. And to move to high integrity credits where your countries, or your countries, but the country, the countries where you're working on energy access and poverty and health and all those issues, they should be getting $40, $50, $75, $100, but there are certain things that have to happen. And I started to work with the team at Africa Great Green Wall, who were very excited. They were starting to look at this and they have, whatever it is, 30 countries in Africa that they work with on stopping deforestation and then reforesting and integrating it with local communities. And you know what happened? President Macron promised, I think it was 10 billion euros to work with Africa Great Green Wall, and they stopped answering the telephone. Not surprisingly, since I don't have 10 billion euros. I have no idea if a euro ever flowed. I don't know if anything ever happened. I don't know, maybe you know.
I'm not sure about that, but we are working with the Congo-based, and we're also working with Gabon, because it's also important to capture carbon sinks, right? You can't say that, people are not going to get funding for preserving their forest, right? Or preserving the lungs of Africa, but you can get money if you cut it all down and then replant it. That's, that isn't something that we're saying, that isn't okay. And again, it has to be priced correctly. But I'm even more excited on the energy side, Michael, right? Because what is our true energy transition if we think about it? It's diesel and petrol gensets, right? Most of them are less than 6 kVA, right? So most of them can have some solar plus storage solution. And they are high integrity because it's either there or it's not. It's actually one of the easiest things to verify as well, right? It's not like I planted 1 million trees that way and there was a flood. It's like if you're connecting and you're using diesel, you see, like you were saying, the health center. And if you're using solar for storage, you can see and you can capture that. We realize that there is methodology, but it's not as robust because let's think about it. Apart from Africa, how many other places do you have diesel and petrol gensets as almost your main source of energy instead of your backup energy? So again, we're working, obviously working with the UN as well, with UNFCCC to say, no, we need to have these methodologies in place, right? we need to have it properly priced and move forward. But it's, it's a program that it's gonna take a life of its own. It's going to be run by Africans in Africa. I'm super excited to be part of like kind of like the founding I guess cohort of the of initially, but it is something that, really, really hoping it will be big, it will be huge, gives people hope, because it's not fun going back and saying, okay, we want to do this. Oh yeah, I want to go clean, but I have no idea where the financing is coming from. And if people are having problems with emerging economies, they're not going to put any money in the developing world. And we just have to be honest with people while challenging the norms.
Very good. And then the third of your 3 finance-related initiatives.
My last super excited one is or that I'm excited about. Sorry. Okay. I'm just trying to speak there. The third one that I'm excited about is something called REMI, which is Renewable Energy Manufacturing Initiative. We've got an African one and we've got a Southeast Asian one. The African one is the most developed, where we said, okay, fine. How do we make Africa a production hub instead of just an extractive continent? So we looked at 2 key things, just solar PV and lithium battery manufacturing. And we identified 6 countries for that, all at different stages of manufacturing. Again, it's really important that, if, again, taking my country, like a state near Abuja, Nasarawa state, people mine lithium, send it to China, and then bring it back 100 times the cost. That's just what we're used to. That's life. We're like, no. How do we change that? It's also coming at the right time, because even the Chinese and the Indians are trying to spread out their supply chain. The time it is taking to get things on continent and to different places is important. And then in the African sense, because we're all doing quite a lot of clean energy projects, and with like the African Continental Free Trade Zone and things like that, how do we actually sell and trade to ourselves? So that is the last one. I'm super excited to say, look, how do we actually make this work? With instead of like, oh, you're not a manufacturing hub, like, no, like if there are key off takers and there's money to be made and there are jobs to be created, these are the things that really make the building blocks for the energy transition that we don't really hear about in a lot of these public statements.
I have a question on that. It makes perfect sense that if you've got the minerals to move up the value chain and actually get the jobs and the value add, to do more of the manufacturing. My question is this: I'm also advisor to the UK Board of Trade, and one of the issues that has always plagued the developed countries love to import all of the raw materials tariff-free, but not the manufactured goods. Have you looked at that? Are you finding that there are tariffs if you start to make not just lithium, but you start to make battery components, or not just, I don't know, some of the raw rare earth minerals, but if you started to make permanent magnets, would you then be hit by tariffs? Is that something we also need to work on?
Yes, I mean, you'd be hit by tariffs not just by the UK and the EU, but also the US. But everyone's also assuming that, there can't be enough trading within continent. There's not enough off-takers within, like, if Morocco has a PV plant, why can't Ghana buy from them? You know what I mean? We're going to all use this, right? There's all these programs every year, but we do have to challenge the international and the developed world. And I think, if everybody is being honest about the fact that we really, really need to diversify our supply chains just to get things there. A considerable amount of the minerals are going to come for Africa. So if African countries, like I think Uganda has just passed a law or policy saying you have to produce something when you don't know if it was cobalt or whatever material they took out, that you have to do a level of production. It may not be the full level in country. If more and more countries say that, you will get things turning. Perfect example is DRC. Everyone's like, ooh, DRC, but there's a lot of companies working in DRC, and they're there because they're extracting minerals. And we have to, where it makes sense, we have to not just make ourselves an extractive continent that, buys back, the finished goods at extraordinary prices.
Yeah, I'm nervous about local content rules, if I'm honest, because the risk is that it ends up just driving up the costs of whatever it is, because it's not the naturally best place to manufacture. So the emphasis, in my view, needs to be on what does it take to make these countries the best place to, move up the value chain and do some refining, some manufacturing, and so on, rather than a sort of blunt instrument of a local content rule. And I know from other industries that very often that just ends up being a kind of tax on the goods, because you kind of, you almost have to buy it out, even though it's higher cost, because that's the rule, but you'd rather not, and which doesn't actually serve the purpose.
I don't know. I'm in two ways. I don't see anything wrong in local content if it makes sense. And at a certain point, it might be more expensive to get your market to thrive. I think you've seen that with lots of projects you've done in Europe and stuff. You haven't done projects necessarily that were cost effective. Look at offshore wind, but you knew you would get to a point, right? So you invested a lot at the beginning, right? And it did have that. I think when it comes to Africa, everyone, ooh, local content. But if you look at the rules in a lot of countries, even the whole way the EU are, it's local content to the extreme. I feel like this rules now that we have and saying that, free for all, it's not working. So something must work, right? And again, I'm not saying that every country should say, don't do this, if that, but then there needs to be something where you actually appreciate, what's happening in the countries. At least if you're bringing the batteries back, bring it back with the same tax-free element of it. But one of your points is valid. It can't work in every single country. Size does matter. Manufacturing capacity does matter. Access does matter. And these are all the different things that we've looked like. So I will send you our report and highlighting each countries and, where they are, because there's kind of like I don't want to call it a grading system, but ones that are a lot more advanced than others, like countries like Egypt and Morocco.
Oh, and by the way, just to be clear, my critique of local content was not about Africa or developing countries. When I see the efforts that are going into manufacturing, certainly solar in Europe, the real question is, why is Europe not a great place to make solar? Why did, frankly, flat screen TVs or iPads, why did all that go to China and Southeast Asia, or to Asian countries, not just Southeast Asia, but to Asian countries? And we really need to understand why that is, because at the end of the day, very often they're using European or American equipment and global capital, and there's no labor involved anymore. These are highly automated plants. So what is it? And until we really understand and address that, it ends up just being, it just pushes up the costs. And I'm worried about, European gigafactories for batteries. There's now, I don't know how many plans there are. There's sort of 30 or 40 gigafactories. And if they just make expensive batteries, it actually ends up harming Europeans and not helping them. So you've obviously hit on a sort of favorite topic of mine.
No, that's great. But Europe always has a way of subsidizing everything to work. to work for their benefit. But no, you're right.
Yes, but they sacrifice innovation and growth rate,
Yeah.
and therefore well-being. You have these countries that have had no economic growth for, you look at Italy, so there's a cost to that. That's the only point I would make. But let's move on, because I think that you also make an interesting point, which is about intracontinental trade in Africa, which is sort of invisible to a lot of people in the developed world. We don't really think about it. We had a fantastic episode 120, with Anna Hajduka, who's building a business, Africa Green Co., which is about providing guarantees for new renewable energy projects, but it is enabled by the fact that there are now emerging regional grids. So there's sub-Saharan Africa, or the Southern Africa electricity network, modeled on actually the Scandinavian network. So you can actually start to trade electricity much more liquidly between countries. And I was very struck by that. I don't know whether that's something you've helped to push for, or whether that influences some of the programs that you run.
Well, I did work on the West African Power Pool, and there's also now an East African Power Pool as well. And I think these grids are very, very important, especially in the intermittencies of renewable anyway. I feel like a lot more investment is needed, and for the West African region, it's really ECOWAS that's also driving all the different countries to to work on them. It's for me, the infrastructure is always something that no one really talks about. Everyone talks about the generation and the last mile, but the transmission, the distribution, the metering is really, really critical. And that's where the real work is, and that's where typically people don't want to invest in because it's on the ground, and you just can't take it away if something goes wrong. So making utilities work, because utilities really have to work for power pools to work, transmission networks work, transmission network operators, market operators, understanding what pricing really, really goes in. Even if you're going to subsidize the market, it's really, really important. So I feel like that there's that commercial element, throughout countries, which is hard to get buy-in, because politics and everything comes in. But it definitely, power pools, are really the future, and should be embraced if done properly. But while we're doing those, we can't forget connection to the last mile, and we can't connect. Some people have to be connected to a grid. It can't always be decentralized.
I mean, it's a point that I definitely wanted to highlight in this conversation, because, if you look at, we started with clean cooking and these sort of rooftops and microgrids, and I want to make sure that the audience is not left thinking that all of Sustainable Energy for All is all about that kind of rural stuff where people can't or don't or never will have connection to the grid. The grid connection piece, and then how we balance that and trade power, and the power pools, East, West, Southern Africa, and indeed connections from Northern Africa or the Mediterranean Rim into Europe are going to be absolutely critical as well.
Absolutely. And we have to understand that you're working with a continent that in most places haven't most places haven't had an industrial revolution, and they want to, and that would need a considerable amount of energy. So it's not just small projects, and it's not just energy poverty isn't just last mile. It's energy poverty to really, really grow businesses. And that's why you need, a lot more energy, sustainable energy. And like I would say, the infrastructure and the commercial structures. So you don't just say, okay, the utility doesn't work, that's okay. We've got lots of utilities that don't work in the, developed world, but the structures are in place to at least make it seem like it's working, and to make there's a pathway of, if you want to connect new energy. And on that point, I think it's important that even when we do mini grids, especially from my experience, the design that we came up with, especially in Nigeria, was you come up with a design that allows for a connection to the grid when the grid gets there. Yeah. So it's not just doing these things in isolation, thinking the grid will never get there. And then you strike a deal between the mini grid developer and the grid, because that distribution infrastructure has been built out. So it is very, very important. Because people don't have something doesn't mean they just have a minimum level, like just, a few lighting points and a charging thing is okay. That isn't okay. We are really trying to push for 1,000 kilowatt hour minimum. We feel like that is what is needed to really, really live a dignified life.
Yeah, the future-proofing these developments so that they can later be connected, and ideally so they can still later be islanded again. So if there is a power cut, you can still go back to using your mini grid. That would be the best of all worlds. I want to just come on to a final topic, if we might, which is, you've talked about Africa wants to have an industrial revolution, and that the people have every right to the 1,000 kilowatt hours per year, and they have the right to, or the expectation of, reliable power, not just power when it's windy and when it's sunny, but also power throughout. And we all know from what we're learning in the developed world that batteries will get you a certain distance. If you've got very limited power requirements, then you can put a battery with solar and that's fine, that will work. But if you really want 24/7, power quality like they have in Germany or in Northern Europe or in the US or Japan, South Korea and so on, then you've got to do something to keep the lights on for fairly extended periods where it's not sunny and not windy. And by experience, I mean, more than a day, more than 2 days, that's the reality, that the resources can drop away. Where I'm going with this, as you know, is it okay to rely on gas and to develop gas projects, which is the technology of choice in the developed world, to keep the lights on in those situations? Is that okay for the countries you work with to go down the exact same route?
So first, the countries might not have gas. So, it's very different. I mean, this conversation has been going on really intensely for the last 3 years, right? What fuel source should be used, what should be used for base load, what should be used for industry. And I have been trying very hard, especially over the last year, to change the conversation. The conversation shouldn't just be about the fuel source. First, I disagree that you should tell any sovereign what they need to do. I think you need to advise them. And then whatever the sovereign wants to do is a sovereign's choice, but you can provide advice. I think the conversation needs to be in the one we're having prior about what does it take to fund the energy transition. And that's not just the generation part. That is the distribution, the network, the policies, the forex policies, everything you need to put in place. The energy transition that we're asking these countries to do is a transition of their entire economy. What happens to their transport sector? What happens to their oil and gas sector? What happens to their building sector? How do they deal with clean cooking? How do they deal with agriculture, which seems to be one of the largest emitting industries now? The fuel source doesn't allow to have those conversations. So no, I think if anybody, I can only advise, of what people want to develop, but I don't think there should be just this or nothing. There needs to be a full range of options for people to be able to choose from, because it actually is a transition. But we have to understand that at the heart of everything, we do have to get to a point of net zero, right? We do know that this is affecting a climate crisis. So the cleaner, more sustainable we do it, everything we need to do has to be on a pathway. And I guess for me, the stuff that's more scary is how is it going to be funded? Those are the conversations we should be having, not how is what going to, like, just agree to fund the transition, right? You know what I mean? Just agree to the cost of funding the transition, and the numbers are really, really big. They are huge, not just for coal dependent regions or things like that, just high population regions. Once you agree that the pathway of how you get it, I feel it's a much easier place. You just need to make sure that the entire energy transition, and not just the generation of fuel source, is at top of mind.
But it's a great answer, but if I could just push a little bit, because so I had Alain Ebourbisse, who's the CEO of Africa 50, infrastructure investor, and his point was that, okay, so you have your plan for the transition, and Nigeria 2060, I think that's a fantastic and it's the correct goal to get to net zero by 2060. What it doesn't say is what you should do in 2030, 2040. It says that by 2050 you need to go out.
No, it does. It says what you have to do year on year.
Well, but it doesn't say how you keep the lights on and provide 24/7 reliable power for the next few decades.
It absolutely does. It actually even shows when you have to peak, in using some of these fuel sources, and when you have to ramp down again. So it says that it's a realistic model. And that's why you need to, it literally says year on year what needs to be developed, right? What base load is needed, what are the fuel sources that are needed there till a certain point, right? And then going back down again. So that's why I'm funding the entire track.
Okay, so agreed. So it goes. So there's some. You'll sort of. There'll be first investment in one portfolio, and then it has to peak and go back down again. Now, then some of that investment is going to go into. You call it baseload. I actually prefer peaking or flexibility, because baseload gets us into a whole discussion about whether it runs 24/7 or just intermittently. But Alain's point was that some of that investment realistically needs to go into gas. And what you have is a bunch of developed country investors and multilaterals that say, well, we understand the transition. We understand that arc that says first we push, for energy access, universal, reliable, etc., and then we make sure it's cleaner and cleaner until the point where it's net zero. But the developed country financial institutions and the multilaterals don't want to fund the fossil piece. So they all want to pick out the plums of the nice wind farm and the solar and the microgrid, and even if they do the transmission, etc. But his plea, and this was actually before COP, when we last spoke, before COP26, his plea was, please don't forbid essentially developed country and multilateral investors from investing in gas in Africa, which is needed for the next few decades to keep the lights on.
I I disagree with the fact that they're funding anything. That's what I'm trying to get to, right? We're not having the same conversation. They're not funding anything, right? There's no, and that's what I'm trying to say. Like, fund something. If you bring 100 billion to the continent for renewables, we will do renewables, right? If you bring 100, like, just bring money. They're not funding anything. You're not funding it. When you come and say you want to even fund, it has to have a perfect PPA with a sovereign guarantee and everything in place, and it's taking years. So that's my issue, right? That's why I say you have to fund the transition. Fund any part of it, but fund something. They are not funding, very, very select projects that don't have the impact that we're talking about. I work for Sustainable Energy for All. It would take me years before I get 100 million for renewables. The same renewables we're trying to push, right? For the same microgrids they're trying to push, So it's not the funding situation is much larger than that. Choose something you want to fund and let's talk about it. What is happening is that you're using a conversation of no fossil to fund nothing. And that's why I want to get out of it. Like, if you're saying that, okay, we don't want to fund any fossil, perfect, no problem. But can you bring a few billion to fund something else? No one's going to have a problem with it. What you're saying is that don't fund something and we're not going to fund, we don't have anything on the table. And that is the honest truth. And we have to be honest with ourselves. We really do. Because everyone goes, oh, there's so much money for renewables. No, there's not. There's not. There's not so much money around the continent for clean energy. Barely 4 countries can get funding for that out of over 50. That's a fact.
What is your message then to activists? I also had Bill McKibben on this, on this program on cleaning up, and their number one priority is to block fossils. They're not out on the street saying fund something. Hopefully it's clean. What they're saying is don't do the Mozambique pipeline because it's a post-colonial construct and so on. That's what's getting Bill McKibben out onto the street and getting arrested. And he's saying that the young activists in Africa are totally on that agenda, and they are also protesting not to have fossil. But if your what would you say to people whose number one agenda is don't have fossil, rather than, as you've said, fund something?
Like, for me, I don't like preaching to anybody, but the number one agenda must be to get people out of energy poverty. You must look at the landscape and say, I want to get someone out of poverty. Where's the money to get someone out of poverty? Where's the money to reduce the infant mortality rate? Where's the money for women not to be dying because they're using clean cooking? Let's put it back to people, right? People-centered energy transition that still gets us to a place of net zero, but we can't keep having these debates that don't get to the crux of it. And the crux of it is, if you look at the money that's going in to Africa, 1.5% of all renewable investment, it's absurd. It is embarrassing. So while you're having whatever fights you're having, at least fight for more to be coming in, and we will know how to utilize that. But right now, nothing is happening, and we need to really be honest with it.
I completely agree with you. I push you because I want to try and get more people to have clarity on exactly this issue, but I agree completely with you. If you have time for just one other comment, what are you doing on the international sort of stage to get that money? So we've got COP28 coming up at the end of this year in the Emirates in Dubai. Is that a big deal, or are you doing other things to try and get this large-scale financing to, so it's no longer embarrassing, as you say?
Well, obviously we start with UNGA, putting it on the agenda of the SG. This is something the SG and the Deputy Secretary General are very, very passionate about. How do we fund? How we come up with another kind of innovative instruments? Is it debt for climate swaps? What are we going to actually do? And this is part of our crisis response group that I'm in at the UN side. So we're going to continue pushing that. COP28 is extremely important. UAE is extremely important because they've made it very clear that Africa is an important voice for them, right? And funding Africa, making sure Africa energy really progresses, true development like you talk, power grid, things that really bring GDP out and really get people to develop. So I'm really excited about working with them. We're currently working with them on a number of things. But more importantly, just, it's important when you're having these conversations just to have Africans in the conversation, right? I don't represent all of Africa. I represent the United Nations, but bring the Africans into the conversation. They are the ones who know what is best for them, instead of this assumption that everybody else knows what's best for them. I don't do that. I don't go to a Ghana or Kenya and say, this is what you should do. I listen to what their priorities is and fit their priorities into our climate target, not the other way around. I think it's really important that we listen and learn and don't just have these preconceived notions on how people should develop.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for spending time with us here today. And I'd like to check back in perhaps next year after the UNGA, after COP28, and when you've had a bit of time to absorb the results of those, and let's see whether we have moved this incredibly important agenda forwards.
Of course, Michael. Look forward to being challenged again by you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Michael.
So that was Damilola Ogunbiyi, CEO of Sustainable Energy for All. That's the UN initiative which was first responsible for developing SDG 7 on clean energy and which continues to lead on energy access around the world. And if you missed Damilola's first appearance on Cleaning Up, that was episode 62 in November 2021. For more on the topics we discussed, there's episode 118 with Achim Steiner, who is the co-chair with Damilola on UN Energy. You can also catch Elizabeth Wathuti, founder of Green Generation Initiative, planting trees across Africa, Bill McKibben, activist and author, and Ala Ebubise, CEO of Africa 50. Those are all highly relevant episodes, and we'll put links into the show notes. If you've enjoyed today's conversation, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to Cleaning Up, or leave us a review on your chosen podcast platform. And if you want more from Cleaning Up, sign up for our free newsletter at cleaningup.live, where you'll find our archive of over 150 hours of conversation with extraordinary climate leaders. And why not help someone else learn more about the net zero transition by introducing them to Cleaning Up? Cleaning Up is brought to you by our lead supporter, Capricorn Investment Group, the Liebreich Foundation, and the Gilardini Foundation.